Good afternoon to what will be a very different kind of schools forum meeting. I'm hopeful that everything will go smoothly, but please bear with any of us who perhaps don't do things in quite the right way, particularly me. I'll be grateful for any support that I can have if I mess things up. Hopefully that won't happen. First of all, can I ask Joe if there are any apologies for absence?
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, apologies received from Dan Johnson, Brian Bartlett and Lynn Dans. Okay,
thank you. And we have, well, actually two, but there are three members of the Schools Forum to welcome today. So there's David Alexander, who's head teacher representing secondary maintained schools. Lynn Dance, I think, was in attendance at the last meeting, but now is a full member of the Schools Forum. Unfortunately, she's had to send her apologies, as Joe has just said. But she's a head teacher representing Academy Special Schools. And then Becky Martin, welcome to Becky, who's a governor representing Maintained Special Schools. Also joining the meeting this afternoon, we have Amber Ludlam from the Education Skills Funding Agency. She's from the Local Authority Funding Policy team, and they are monitoring the effectiveness of the operation of schools forums during the period of the pandemic and in the light of the need to meet remotely as we are. Also joining the meeting this afternoon is Charlotte Jones. As most of you will be aware, Tim Brown has now left the Local Education Authority. So Charlotte Jones, welcome Charlotte, who is now the Acting Director of Education. And then a couple of other people, Simon Harper, who you will have heard from already. He's head of Democratic Services, and he's here to help facilitate the meeting because of the remote nature of it. And also Ryan Mitchell, who is here as technical support for WebEx itself. Could I now move on to ask if there are any declarations of interest? If there are, can you raise your hand, as it were? Okay.
I'm not seeing any, Andrew. Nobody's raising their hand.
Excellent. Good. And any public questions, Joe? Do we have any public questions?
None received.
Okay, thank you. There will be some clear breakpoints, and much of this meeting will be devoted to Phil's presentation. There will be clear breakpoints in that presentation for members to ask questions or to make comments. Can I just encourage members of the Schools Forum to please do contribute to the meeting, do ask questions, do make comments. I appreciate it's difficult when you can't see everybody else. You haven't got the sort of subliminal messages of everybody who's seeing who's trying to make a point and so on. So I appreciate that makes it a little bit different, a little bit difficult perhaps in some respects, but please contribute, and it'd be really great if we can have an active discussion as we go through the meeting. Also, in normal meetings, sometimes we don't have to take votes because you can get a sense of the meeting. There's a sense that there's a consensus in the meeting in favour of a recommendation, in favour of a suggestion, whatever it might be. Getting that consensus when we are remote is going to be almost impossible. And therefore, there will be more occasions when we'll have to take a vote than would normally be the case. So this afternoon, I think there's one item regarding dedicated schools grant where we have to take a vote, and also when we get onto the item about the Constitution. And obviously, if anything else turns up during the meeting, which requires a vote, then we'll have to do that rather than just getting a feel for the meeting. I think that's fair to say. Okay, can we now move on to the minutes of the last meeting, which was on the 9th of January, a very long time ago, when the world was a very different place. So first of all, could I ask if anybody wants to raise any issues with the meeting minutes in terms of accuracy? If you raise your hand, if there's anything about accuracy that you want to ask about.
Nothing, Andrew.
Okay, thank you for that. Sorry?
No one's put their hand up, so that's
okay.
Fine.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So if now we could move on to matters arising from those minutes. So, sorry. So on page 2, I mean, there are no matters rising there as far as I'm aware. On page 3 over onto page 4, and there's a recommendation there that the surplus funding from the schools block could be moved over to support, to offer the support as described. So that's in place. Page 4, again, no matters rising there, I don't think, which are not covered in this meeting. Similarly, page 5. I think, therefore, there's nothing that we need to mention now, particularly as a matter arising, which isn't going to be covered in this meeting, unless anybody feels I've missed something out. Again, please raise your hand if that's the case. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. So could we move on to agenda item 5, which is to look at the impact of COVID-19 on DSG funding. So that's item 5. So Phil, can I ask you to take us through this, please?
Yeah, you can hear me okay, right?
Yeah, I can hear you, Phil. Yeah, no problems.
Okay. I wasn't planning to spend a lot of time on this, but I thought, given the context and all of the adjustments that have had to be made in the education system around the COVID-19 pandemic, it was valuable just to spend a little bit of time talking about the financial impacts across the whole DSG. So there's obviously fairly early on, it was announced that the school funding as it is in the DSG fully would be protected. So actually funding levels for all schools in mainstream and through high needs has been protected fully. There is obviously an opportunity to access additional funding related to the exceptional costs that came through COVID-19. DfE published guidance on that. As a local authority, we've sent out a kind of template for schools to be able to use to track some of those expenses. And the kind of 3 areas that were identified by the department were around increased premises cost, support for free school meals, and any additional cleaning costs. We have, when the guidance went out to schools, kind of made it clear that if there are other costs that fall outside of that they feel are as a direct impact of COVID-19, then they should also record those. Collectively, when we're in a position to do so, we can take a look at that and assess the position. But overall, in terms of funding, and I'd be interested to hear any feedback from the heads around the table, schools shouldn't have been significantly adversely affected, certainly from an income perspective, and with those accommodations for additional costs from an expenditure perspective as well. Funding levels for early years. Early years is a slightly different matter because obviously the early years sector is only partially funded by the dedicated schools grant, and the private income is a significant part of the early years landscape. As with many other businesses in the country at the moment, they've had access to a number of different funding routes from the government. The key one in terms of early years provision has been around the opportunity to furlough staff related to that private income. It's certainly in our dialogue and conversations with providers, it's been an area where there's been significantly more concern raised around funding. The feedback and the conversations with schools has been a lot about the provision and what's needed in terms of supporting vulnerable children and the continuation of education provision in the way it's been described in guidance. Early years, similarly, but a significantly different picture around some of the funding issues. And it would seem that those with higher proportions of privately funded income are the ones that have struggled the most. Sarah Hilton, who leads on early years for the council, has been working closely with them. In many cases, some of those providers have had to close. So we've been managing sufficiency of places across the county, and to date have done that well. There's been no issues with providing places, but there have to be some movement, and that was in the main because there were a proportion of providers that just financially didn't feel they could stay open for a small number of children that were DSG funded. There is an opportunity in the funding arrangements for us to be able to look at moving money in early years if we felt we needed to. There's a provision in the guidance that if we were struggling with sufficiency of places and that providers that were staying open were going significantly above numbers that they would be expected normally to be funded for, then we'd be able to move money to support that. We haven't had to do that yet, and at this moment in time, the feeling is we won't need to do that, particularly as now we're starting to move into a reopening for early years. The other thing, I guess, to note was that obviously the council received funding to support COVID-19 in the response to the pandemic, and then we've ring-fenced £500,000 to support vulnerable children, particularly focusing around the transition back into education. And we set up which is yet to meet yet, but we're setting up a working group that will meet to start looking at transition back in from September. I know that obviously children are transitioning back in now. I think we're, given the timescales and the need to get that right, we're looking at plans that we can put in place to September to support when obviously we would expect more children and young people to be coming back into education in some way, shape or form. Obviously we don't know what that looks like at the moment. What we do know is that having had a significant period of time out of education, our most vulnerable children will struggle to access education again, or at least a proportion will. And what we want to be able to do is start to proactively look at solutions around that, so that come September and October, we're not in a position where we're looking at fixed rates of fixed term exclusion, permanent exclusion going back up, or that we see a spike in education, health and care plans to support a short-term need created by COVID-19. So the aim is to look at how can we use that funding proactively to support the system, and some recommendations and things will come out of the working group. We have invited head teachers from across the sector to be involved in that, primary, secondary, as APS representation. In fact, I believe that's going to be Elisa, the hospital education service, and the special schools as well. So that's probably all I wanted to say on that. I would be interested to see if there's any feedback specifically from schools around the funding position and the impact of COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Phil. Can I ask?
You've got Stuart Wilson and Steve Savoury that wanted to raise issues.
Okay. So, Stuart, I understand that you'd like to raise an issue relating to this COVID-19 funding.
It's one comment and one question, Andrew, if that's okay. The comment was that one of the losses of income that schools will experience is a loss of lettings income. Certainly at Marling, that's one of our significant concerns over the period. It's quite a decent sum of income for the schools. So that's with regards to the DSG. I think you're absolutely right, Phil. There's no experience of loss of income, but it will be for those peripheral income streams that are so beneficial to schools. And the second one is a question for Phil. I've heard, Phil, that any claims for exceptional costs related to COVID won't be paid if the school has a carry forward surplus. Are you aware of that at all?
We haven't seen definitive guidance yet at this stage as to how that will be processed and whether the carried forward surplus will affect that. That I have also heard that, but I've not seen that written in any of the guidance. Admittedly, there has been a lot of guidance to wade through on it, but I haven't seen that documented anywhere. at this stage. So I think on that, it's best to wait until we get a clear steer on exactly how that funding will be allocated. And I'm not clear as to how that would work if that was the position that would be taken, because if you've retained a surplus to support a specific piece of work or development in the school, it's towards school improvement, etc., you shouldn't be penalised and retain that to undertake. So I think that, you know, we'll await the guidance, but I think it would be a difficult position to take.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, Stuart, was that any surplus?
I didn't have any specific details, Andrew. It was just a comment that a carry forward surplus of some form would prevent the money being paid. But I agree with Phil. I don't see how it's possible to apply that criteria.
Well, it would mean that most schools would get no support because most schools carry forward a surplus.
Exactly.
I would have thought.
Yeah.
Most is generous, but yeah.
Okay, all right. A fair number then. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Stuart. Steve, you'd like to make a comment? Hello, Steve.
You're muted, Steve. Go again.
I may have. Am I unmuted?
Hear you now. Yeah, that's fine.
Fab. Thank you. I think as far as the primary schools that I'm aware of, the increased premises costs, free school meals and cleaning costs are reasonably significant, but they are offset by no supply funding. We haven't been able to use or been willing to use supply teachers, so broadly offset. However, in September, if we're back to normal, and we may well be using supply staff to maintain pupils in school, the increased cleaning costs and premises costs will still be there.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, Phil.
No, I was just going to say, and I think if going back to the previous point, I think that would be a more reasonable position to take if we were looking at if moving forward we're looking at how we might offset some of the additional costs in the system, that it would be a loss of expenditure or reduced expenditure in other areas rather than use of surplus that might be offset against the additional expenditure.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other comments that anybody wants to make?
Murphy, and we've got Will Morgan as well. And Phil, could you just drop the presentation off the screen, because then it's easier because we can see everyone. It's better for now you've gone through it. Is that all right? Yeah, that's better. Thank you. Yeah,
this is quite a bit more, but yeah, go on.
Okay, Sarah Murphy. Sarah?
Hello, everybody. So I'm Sarah Murphy representing unions, and it's almost, Steve, as if we've been talking before this meeting, which in fact, obviously we haven't. But the point I wanted to raise was about supply. Obviously, in the context of a caseworker, I've over the last few months received tens and tens of emails from supply teachers over the circumstances that they found themselves in. And I appreciate that it depends on the nature of their contract. So some have managed to be furloughed through agencies. Some have still been in receipt of their wages via schools if they had some level of contract. But an awful lot of supply staff have found themselves in a situation of receiving no money. And obviously the union's been trying to support them in the best way they can. So I guess this is a plea to say, when you're possibly planning work for the autumn, or even possibly whatever our summer schools are going to look like, obviously we don't know what that's going to be like at the moment. There's a whole tranche of supply teachers in Gloucestershire who for many months now have not received salary and have suffered obviously because of it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. And Will.
My point was, Stuart actually answered my point, but I pulled my hand down. But I just want to ask Phil if he could chase that one up, because it does seem very unfair that any school with a surplus can't, you know, and I might, as it said, might have been saving that money for a reason, can't claim for the additional costs. I think that's quite important.
We've got regular catch-ups with the DfE, so we can raise that point specifically. I'll make a note.
As Steve said, going forward, these costs are going to continue in terms of cleaning and the increased cleaning we're going to have with more students in. So yeah, thank you.
Understood. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Any more points about COVID-19?
Lisa Jones.
Okay, Lisa Jones.
I've got Gwyneth as well.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we hear you.
Yes.
I just want to mention about the extended school provision. In the primary schools, if you have a breakfast and after school club, that's normally financed from income from the parents paying in. We've obviously continued that provision, but when you've only got a handful of children using it, the income doesn't cover the costs of running it. You can't furlough those staff because they're working. So I have 2 children who are in after school club for 2 hours every night, and I need 2 members of staff. So that is having a financial hit, and I know that other small schools will be affected with that as well.
Okay. And are you recording that in your tracking of additional expenses around COVID, that cost?
I don't know that we have, Phil, because it's a usual expense, not an additional. It's the income that's hit rather than the expenditure, but we'd be happy to add that into the additional costs if you feel.
I think it would be worth doing. It would be worth doing so, because I think what we need to understand is the actual true cost, and that if a loss of income is associated with that. I mean, the approach around that kind of loss of income, the argument would be normally to try and furlough the staff to be able to cover that. But if you haven't been able to do that, then it is effectively creating an additional cost for you. So
yeah, we've furloughed some of the team because we would normally have more people in than that, as I've got 2 sites, but we can't furlough all of them, and obviously the income doesn't cover the expenditure.
I would include it, and I think it's important that we raise and look at all of those issues around the funding, whether it's related to income or additional costs. So would that be
communicated across the primaries then? Because I know it's an issue other heads have as well.
Pop it into. I'll make sure it goes into the next briefing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And Gwyneth.
Hi, hello. A couple of things. Just picking up a little bit on what Lisa said. We're external, so one of my nurseries is on a school site in a Sure Start building, and we run the external services for the school. At the moment, we can't do any we can't have children that are at school but then come to our after school and breakfast club, and likewise. So there's a huge loss there because we can't have children moving from one site to another. So that's impacted quite significantly on us, and also the school can't offer it because we normally offer it. So that's an issue there. So just to sort of reiterate what Lisa had said on that. And also just for early years, just to make the point really, that this is normally our busiest time of year, and we are losing. So for me personally, across my 3 settings, there's 70 children that will be going to school in September. I normally would have that coming up behind as fee-paying young children. Parents are understandably very, very nervous, and I've got nothing coming up behind that. So whereas at the moment I'm protected slightly because I'm able to access the small business rates grant, I'm able to access some furlough, and I'm getting my NEF funding. Once we move into September and October, I think you may find that the early years sector, the strain on us will be even greater, and you will lose a lot more providers because we haven't got the children coming in. Because if you've got an 18-month or a 2-year-old, you're not confident, or you're working from home, I've got nothing behind to protect my preschoolers that will be coming into your sector.
Okay, that's a point that hasn't been raised specifically with me today. Have you picked that with the early years team specifically?
I've worked with Liz Giles and Wendy Gray in commissioning that, and they have all the figures. So I've been doing some work with Helen Black for the children's centres. So I know it's circulating somewhere.
Okay, well, I'm happy to take that one away and pick that up as an issue. I think we are very keen to get ahead of those kind of issues if we can see them coming down the road. And
obviously, I think that's going to be a big issue for us.
Yeah, supply and or volume of children coming into the provision is obviously going to be an impact in September. That sounds like it's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Gwyneth. Any more comments about COVID-19? Funding.
Andrew, can I just ask Lisa to lower her hand? We haven't got any other speakers. Just going in. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. That's great.
Okay.
Anybody else indicating?
That's great. Well, thank you very much for those contributions. Can we now move on to agenda item 6, which is to look at the outturn and maintain school balances. So it's back to Phil. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so with each of the sections in the kind of key reports that were circulated, I'm just going to try and do a bit of a summary, and then, like Andrew said at the start, take any particular questions either generated by the summary or that you had when reading the papers. So the starting point for us was the outturn report, and within the report we kind of detailed the DSG grant outturn for 2019-20, which is showing a total DSG deficit of 6.716 million. Within that, there's a carried forward underspend of 0.126 in the schools block and 1.576 on the early years block. Like I say, creating a kind of net overspend of 6.716, and obviously, as members will know from previous meetings, the bulk of that overspend is related to high needs. So a bit more detail, net underspend, the 0.126 on the schools block. So that was made up of an overspend on the growth fund of 1.39. So growth, in terms of growth, we overspent on that area. And there was an underspend on the dedelegated funded areas, which again, that's the table on the screen was within the report. Ultimately, what that creates is when you bring up the dedelegated alongside the surplus that was on dedelegated funding last year, within the schools block at the moment, there is a 0.622 million carry forward under dedelegated funding. So that is 0.357 from 2018-19 and 265 from this year. So that's a surplus that's still sat against dedelegated provision. The early years, as we said, as I said, is 1.5 underspend. This is a running theme each year as we look to balance based on the census updates. And again, this is a position that we saw last year. It's related to lower than expected payments for the nursery education. And as I say, and in previous years, the schools forum in January, when we got this updated census, we've agreed how to allocate that funding back into early years provision. So that's being held and for a decision that will be discussed at the January census. A high needs overspend within the year was 5.84. I won't talk a lot about high needs because there's obviously a separate report around that. But the key kind of areas of overspend: education, health and care plans, 2.8 million. Independent special school places was up 1.7. Additional special school places that we were accessing above and beyond commission numbers, 0.326, and then a additional cost into ATS of 0.34, which is related to rising staff costs that weren't in the budget and a reduction in some of the traded income that was associated to ATS. That presents us with the kind of recommendation that was in the report, which is the DSG is earmarked as outlined in the table, a total DSG carry forward to 2021 of a deficit of 6.716. You can see the high needs carry forward is totaled within that, so that's previous carry forward and the deficit in 1920 showing the 8.914, and then obviously the dedelegated, which I've already mentioned, in the early years, which is bringing that 8.914 down to the 6.716. So that's where we've kind of got to in terms of an outturn for the DSG this year. The recommendation on the screen and was in the report. I guess that's the point questions?
I'm just looking now, Andrew, for you in terms of no hands up that I can see at the moment.
Okay.
Let me just run. I'm just scrolling up through everyone. So it's big. Yeah, no hands up. No one wanting to speak.
Okay. In that case, so there's a recommendation in the papers, which is that the forum agrees that the DSG deficit at the end of 1920 is earmarked as shown on that table. As I said before, we will need to take a vote on that. So could I ask that if you are in favour of that recommendation, that you raise your hand, please?
What I can do, Andrew, is I can just do what I do for councillors and just do a roll call if you like, so we're absolutely sure.
Okay. Okay.
So what I will do is go through all of you alphabetically by surname, and if you could then indicate, just say for or against or abstain, and then I'll give you the number at the end. Just before I do that, I just want to check that Penny Chislet's not in the meeting. Peter Hales is not in the meeting, and Rachel Howie. Okay, I've got the rest of you. So starting then with David Alexander.
4.
Thank you. Matthew Bishop.
4.
Thank you. Sarah Byrne.
4.
Thank you. Eliza Entwistle. You there? Can't hear you.
4.
Thank you. Andrew Harris.
4.
Thank you, Andrew. Kirsten Harrison. Can't hear you, Kirsten. Are you there?
4.
Thank you. Kate Hawkins. Kate Hawkins, can't hear you. There? Okay. I can't hear Kate. Amanda Horniman. Can you come on and say for, against, or abstain? Okay. I'll come back to you two just in case after. Sorry, is that Amanda? Right, thanks, Amanda. Lisa Jones.
4.
Thank you. Keane.
4.
Thank you. Becky Martin.
4.
Thank you, Becky. David Metcalf.
4.
Thank you. Will Morgan.
Sounds like one of my golf rounds, this. 4.
Thank you, Will. Sarah Murphy.
4.
Thank you. Alexander Norman.
4.
Thank you. Jackie Phillips.
4.
Thanks, Jackie. Steve Savoury.
4.
Thank you. Claire Steele.
4.
Thank you. Adam White.
4.
Thank you. Rob Wilcock.
4.
Thank you. Stuart Wilson. Right, so that brings me to the end. Can I just go back? We've just got Kate Hawkins.
Yeah.
So you're 4 as well?
Yes, 4.
So that is unanimous amongst everyone present, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much.
Recommendation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for your help with that, Simon.
That's all right.
Okay, so moving on now to maintain school balances and so on. So back to Phil.
Yeah. We've kind of provided an outline within the report of where balances for maintained schools sit following the close in 1920. The headlines from that: 170 schools remain in surplus, 33 schools now in deficit, which is a small increase. And I guess not to be unexpected, given that we're at the bottom of the funding dip with additional funding coming into the system this year. In terms of totals, what that means is the maintained school balances decreased by 3.814 million, about 20%. Revenue balance decreases within that at 2.47, and the capital decreases 0.663, and then there was removal of 0.674 in relation to 4 academy conversions. In terms of the individual phases within the sector, primary school revenue surplus decreased by 1.965, down 13.4%. Secondary school revenue surplus increased by 247, and that in the main is due to the fact that obviously there are a small number of secondary maintained schools, and 2 of those are working their way out of deficit, so would have been increasing towards a balance, but still a positive move given the funding levels. Special school revenue surplus is decreased by 108k, it's down nearly 10%, 8.6%. And then alternative provision revenue decreased by 651, and the reason for that is because this is the first time we've reported and held a deficit against the alternative provision schools. Previously, those have been covered and funded within high needs. And in conversations I've been having directly with APS, and at least been involved in those, we've talked about and have changed that approach to ensure that moving forward, any deficits related to APS provision are held and redressed within the school as they would be within any other provision. In terms of oversight of the work, there's been a lot of activity trying to support the schools that are either in deficit or at risk of deficit. There's been a lot of work trying to make sure modelling and the financial planning that's going in is as accurate as we can possibly get it. We have seen, and certainly in my first year here, seen quite, in some instances, quite wide variations in between the original budget that was planned and then the actual outturn. So working with schools closely to do that. What we've seen this year, visits to 28 schools, and we triggered those based on a government budget plan that forecast or predicted a significant in-year deficit or cumulative deficit. So the in-year, just trying to make sure that if a school is, even if they remain in surplus with that in-year deficit, that if there's a significant in-year deficit, that we understand it and are working with them on it. Obviously, if there's a cumulative deficit position, we will be anyway. Half-year returns, so if those are identifying any significant variance, particularly if it's a negative variance, obviously, to the original governor budget plan, that also has triggered visits. And anything that's been escalated from any local authority staff that have been working with the schools around the financial position, so the area finance team, or in some instances the education outcomes and intervention team. In working with them and visiting the schools, I mean, obviously this is a process of challenge, but also support in terms of trying to identify ways that we can support a move towards a balanced budget and then obviously over time out of deficit. There were a number of common issues that arose. First being significant capping in the national funding formula affecting schools. Again, particularly in primary, there were a number of schools whose cumulative deficit and in-year deficit position was really generated by the fact they were being quite significantly capped in the previous funding formula. Now, as we've moved towards the national funding formula this year, that capping is now gone. So that's a positive step forward this year, but it was having still a significant impact. And if you take one individual school as a case on that, a very small primary school actually with 50 children being capped 70,000 was being capped £70,000, which was almost 25% of the overall budget. So that was a significant position and actually really challenging to have a conversation about how you set a balanced budget in those circumstances. So capping was one key message. Resilience to reduce pupil numbers was very low. There was a lot of schools where even smaller impacts and reducing reduced pupil numbers was having significantly more impact on them than it would have done in previous years, and obviously that would be linked to the continued funding pressures that were in the system. And then the final one was class size issues driven by those pupil numbers. Those were the kind of three areas. The class sizes, obviously, for many of the primary schools in particular, making those decisions about number of classes based on pupil numbers was very difficult. We've been managing and supporting schools around the most efficient and best models to try and operate to have effective budgeting, as well as obviously with the education delivery and the quality of the curriculum they're delivering. So those were the kind of three kind of core messages we got back. We were getting back. In the main, I think overall, and I attended all of those really as part of my first year, trying to get a full understanding of the challenges the schools were facing. I think, in the main, with the exception of the issues around the capping, we were able to find solutions and support schools and trying to find a way towards planning a more balanced budget. Obviously, we are yet to receive the full complete budgets for this financial year from all schools. I think we're waiting on 20, and we'll get a clearer position for the September forum as to what the forecast schools will look like for this year, given that there's a positive injection of funding into the system. I guess the other thing I'll mention whilst we're there, and it's not detailed in the report, this, but I did mention in the education conference when I was talking about the funding situation, and have been at every opportunity, I think. The issue that will exist in the system this year, despite the additional funding, and has existed, is the inequity that sits within the national funding formula. And what I've tried to do with these two examples, one for primary, one for secondary, is just articulate in that way that's clear. So the premise here is that within the national funding formula, the uplift, the minimum funding level for primary up to 3,750, there are a number of schools in the county that receive that uplift. I think it's just under 40 primary schools. And what the kind of table shows is the additional needs budgets for two schools within the county. So on the left, school one, a school with high levels of deprivation, low prior attainment, mobility, receiving an additional needs budget of 310,000 into their funding formula. And on the right, a school with lower levels, again, just under a third that, 90,000. And then showing the percentage of the school budget that reflects, and the minimum funding total minimum funding level they receive, and the equivalent per pupil funding. So basically, what it's showing is that on the left, school one has high levels of need, still falls below the 3,750 by £54, so gets a minimum funding level of £54, and then is uplifted to that 3,750. School with very different circumstance, with much lower levels of need in the additional needs element of the budget, comes much further away from the minimum funding level, 459, but then gets the same uplift. So both schools end up with the same amount per pupil funding. And that's articulated again around secondary, and the percentage of secondary schools that receive the minimum funding level is much higher. So 22 of the secondary schools in the county are receiving it, and it again shows the same kind of example. A school on the left, much higher levels of need, receiving a £4 uplift on the minimum funding level. You can see their total additional needs budget is 666,000. School on the right, 10% of it, 63,000, then gets a £521 uplift. And as we move forward, and when we're talking about the kind of inequities and balance and the difference in balances in schools across the county, maintained schools particularly, that actually this is still going to be an underlying factor in why some of the schools are struggling more than others to try and balance budget. And that is where the 1 in 40 model from high needs has been implemented in the past to try and support and balance out inequity. So that high level of need, the 1 in 40 and 1 in 75 as it was previously, was there intending to try and make sure there was some funding coming from high needs to be able to support those schools that have that higher level of need, but it isn't being recognised through the national funding formula. That was the final one on that particular part of the report. So again, I guess there's an opportunity for questions, thoughts, or comments. Stop sharing to you, Simon.
You've got Stuart Wilson and Steve Savory.
Okay, Stuart, can I ask you to your comments first, please?
I think I left my hand up from the voting when we first started voting, so I've taken it down again.
Okay, all right. Steve?
I'm guessing that it's not a surprise to any of us that that inequity stays there, and it's something we've talked about before, that when the government talk about per pupil funding, it's not a clean amount, if you like, without any additional needs added in. And it's quite horrifying, really, the difference that some schools will face as a result of high levels of need and creeping over the minimum amount, whereas other schools will be at the minimum amount with no high needs. Is there anything that School Forum can do and Gloucestershire can do to once again raise this issue with the government and point out how the national funding formula actually locks in inequity rather than relieving it?
Thank you, Steve. Phil, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, above and beyond what we're already doing, I'm not sure that there is much more we can do. We're engaged with the F40, who, from my experience of working with them this year, do have a good voice and connection into the department, and I've had several good meetings with them around the development of this. Unfortunately, the national funding formula is structured and set up, and I think the funding is in place for it for the next 2 or 3 years. We're unlikely, I think, to see, particularly given everything else that's going on at the moment, broadly any significant change to the funding formula within the next few years. I think my view, certainly at the moment, is that as a forum, we need to be doing our best to make sure that we can counteract some of those inequity just in the way that we're using funding that we do have discretion over. That was where the conversation at the last forum came up about the surplus within schools block, and also where we've continued to try to support the 1 in 40 despite the increasing pressure on the high needs budget. We recognise it, and I think that the lobby groups are the best way to be able to access and to try and influence. Unless anybody else has any insights that would be helpful.
I think it's somewhat strange, isn't it, that you have a minimum pupil funding level, and you would have thought that that is the basic amount that you need to run a school of a certain size, and then additional needs should be additional to that. It's somewhat of a conflict where you have a minimum per pupil funding level, which includes additional needs for some schools, but not for others. It kind of doesn't make much sense. So really, the move should be to a minimum pupil funding level, which is what all schools get, and the additional needs are on top of that. So you have additional funding for additional needs. Perhaps that's too simple.
That is the model that I mean, to give confidence around the work the F40 are doing. They have produced a needs-led funding model which they've shared with and are advocating for, and it is exactly that approach of minimum funding level being the per pupil amount that you need to run the school, and then additional needs being funded above and beyond that. And like you say, it does seem to make sense.
Okay,
so we've got David, Alexander, and Jackie Phillips.
Okay. Sorry, I did butt in there. I probably shouldn't have done that. David.
Thank you. Can I ask a simplistic question, Phil? Is this replicated in other authorities that have a different model? And I'm just thinking in terms of Gloucestershire or Kent or something like that. Is there a certain pattern in the way that education is shaped in those counties, for instance, that might replicate what we've got, and then perhaps other counties that don't have that?
I think no. I think generally the issue exists in all counties. I think it is more accentuated in some than others. But the issue with the formula is a national one. And I guess regardless of the makeup of the types of school within the county or local authority, all local authorities are struggling with this. And obviously the pressure on high needs generally. And this does play a part in understanding why there are increasing pressures on the high needs budget and schools actively seeking additional funding through the education, health and care plan route to try and make sure they're able to support the children with additional needs, where currently the funding formula doesn't quite work for them.
Thank you. Jackie.
Thank you, Andrew. Someone has also mentioned lobbying groups who have a national ear with the government, and you mentioned the F40. Can I ask, is the county also speaking with the National Governance Association that is also trying to drive forward on this front?
If I'm honest, Jackie, I'd need to take that away to find out if anybody directly is working with the NGA around this. The work of from the funding side has been very much through the F40, because NGA is a part of that F40 group, so they're supporting that. So by working through the F40, we're working with the NGA, a range of other councils. There's representation from our school, NEU. So there's a range of different bodies involved in that group, and that has felt the most expedient way to engage with the broad audience that are trying to affect this issue.
Thank you. As long as the NGA is being copied in by the F40, I'm happy with that answer. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. We've still got Steve. You've still got your hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to come back and make another comment, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It strikes me that our local MPs are all very satisfied that the national funding formula is fine and there are no problems. The analysis you've done, I suspect they probably ought to know about, particularly those who's got these schools in their constituency. And I just wonder how many of the head teachers appreciate the difference for their funding compared to others, because I can't imagine they've got the ability to be able, or necessarily have the figures at hand to be able to do that, because it does make a huge difference. It's something we've been aware of in the school forum, but I wonder how many of the head teachers are aware. And I absolutely agree with the wise words of our chair that really we ought to be pushing for a minimum pupil amount for every pupil plus additional needs.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. I guess raising awareness amongst head teachers is something that the relevant head teacher associations should do. Whether they do or not, I'm not sure anymore. Okay. Thank you very much. Simon, are there any other questions pending? Okay, thank you. I think we move on to Sue Hall now to talk about the children and families outturn. Is that correct, Sue?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay.
So just moving into the next slide. So just going to look at some of the balances that the children and families outturn, which is being presented to, was presented to Cabinet yesterday, showed that children and families overspent by 13.9 million, which is significant when you look at that's 12% of the budget. And there are about 5 significant cost pressures to update the forum with. The first being the external placement budget, which was 8.8 million overspent. And we knew at the beginning of the year that we had some pressure in that budget, but some of the increases in activity over the period November and December significantly put pressure on that budget. And the problem was it wasn't in some of the lower paid, less costly placements. It was residential and supported living. And between them, they're very costly. Placements can be £5,000, £6,000, £7,000 a week plus support costs. So that really put pressure on our budget. We were looking at all high cost placements and reviewing them to ensure that young people were in the right place and were moving appropriately. But those costs are significant, and we have put additional budget into the 2021 budget. But again, the significant pressure that we saw at the end of the last calendar year is going to put pressure on this year's budget as well. Safeguarding staff, again, particularly to do with the use of agency staff to cover gaps and vacancies, but also to ensure that we're providing the capacity that's needed within teams to ensure an acceptable caseload for each social worker. So additional cost there of 2.9 million. Again, that's significant. But what has happened over the end of last year or during last year was that we opened the Social Work Academy, which means that we've got a much better support for newly qualified and students supporting them. We also improved our recruitment and advertising services. So we are expecting to see that budget come back closer to balance this year as we look into putting more measures into recruit. It's really difficult to recruit experienced social workers. So what we're trying to do is to develop our own and develop those during and increase the number of permanent staff. Youth support is a combination of above really, so care leavers packages for some complex care leavers and also staff costs. And then the Section 17 discretionary payments, that's linked to increased activity with numbers of children in need and requiring support, as well as the numbers of foster care. And again, we put, I think, an additional £500,000 into the 2021 budget. And the final point is home to school transport, where we saw a cost increase, particularly towards the end of the year as costs came through. Again, the increase in the number of SEN routes and the transport needed, particularly for solo routes for some young people. Also with some providers, their contracts being terminated because of their standards weren't up to acceptable levels, and the procurement of those new routes increased in additional cost. And we're already at sort of the latter part of last year looking at an increased cost pressure into this year. Who knows what that will be with the impact of COVID-19 on what measures we'll have to provide for home to school transport, particularly in the secondary sector. So those were some of the key areas that were overspent last year, and there were some underspent offsetting that, but those were the significant ones to bring to the forum's attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Can I ask if anybody would like to ask any questions about the points that Suzanne has made?
Got no one, Andrew.
Okay. All right.
Hang on. Someone's just come up.
It's me. Sorry, Andrew. Can I just ask?
Kirsten.
Hi. Can I just ask? There are a number of transport services, bus companies that have actually gone out of business that have been providing school transport. Do these costs, or will these costs take into account trying to find alternative providers for those that have literally disappeared rather than being below satisfactory service levels.
Thank you, Kirsten.
So these costs include where we've had to re-procure routes for providers who were happy with their standard of provision. So that's the costs that are included in it. And going forward, we'll need to ensuring that all the provision is to the required standard. And that will put a cost pressure, I think, on the council as we look to see what that procurement costs are. Clearly, we're trying to keep costs down as much as possible. But again, we need to pay for acceptable provision to ensure the transport is safe.
That would also apply, wouldn't it? So if a provider went out of business, then the local authority would have to procure an alternative provider.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Any other comments? Sorry, yeah.
Can I just add a little point at the end of that? I guess the only thing to be mindful of with home to school transport is that the impact of COVID-19 is yet to be seen on that. And obviously, until we understand what return in September is going to look like, we won't be able to really quantify that. But it's a significant impact because with any restrictions around social distancing and numbers of children and young people that can be on buses, and that there is certainly more pressure coming to that particular budget generated by COVID.
Yeah, I guess there's a relationship between what the impact is of social distancing on bus capacity together with what the impact of social distancing is on school capacity. There's a kind of a relationship there, isn't there? Okay, obviously. Thank you. So can we move on to agenda item 7, Phil, which is about the high needs budget and strategy?
Yeah, so there's a number of different parts to this. First bit, just to report on the 2021 budget. So the table on screen was outlined in the report, so you've had a chance to have a look at that in advance. Funding allocation, and this is subject to change due to the import-export feature that exists within the funding system. That is for children that are moving across different local authorities. So it'll be a minor change, but it is subject to that minor change. Funding allocation is 67,253,100. Obviously, as we've stated before, that's a significant boost based on the impact of the additional funding. As we discussed at the last meeting, in terms of budgeting, that means that we are still in a position where we're expecting to overspend this year. And the current forecast, based on the trends that we agreed in the last meeting, which were the net increase of 355 EHCPs, and to assume a continued similar split of children moving into the different parts of the education system, we're expecting to overspend by just short of 5.5 million, the 5449 on screen there. That's a significantly different picture to the way we presented last year's budget, but this is, I think, really, we set a budget last year with a small deficit, and by the end of the year came in quite significantly over, with the expectation that the rising trends we were seeing in the system would start to abate. We haven't seen that, and I think it's right to start this year with a true picture of what we would expect to see come through the system if those trends continue. So using that kind of assumption that we'll see a net increase of 355 EHCPs, and that they will broadly go into the similar parts of the system, mainstream, maintained specialist provision and independent specialist provision, that we will come in somewhere around £5.5 million overspending this year. And that is obviously despite that additional income. It's worth noting that the additional income received really kind of aligns with the overspend in 2019-20. And obviously that overspend in 2019-20 is still in the system, and we've got the full year cost of all of it this year. So the increase, obviously highly welcomed, but from my perspective, in terms of meeting the rising level of need, it feels a year late, and that's why we're going to continue to have that the rising costs if the need continues to rise in the way it is. So that is the proposed budget. The forecast movements within that. So that additional increase based on the 355 and the proportion splits, we're expecting an additional £5,495,000 increase into FE top-ups for EHCPs, 807,000 on the primary top-ups, 322 into secondary, 2.6 million increase in spend on places in independent specialist provision, and a 1.9 million increase in special school places. 308,000 is associated to salary increases and staff costs, so inflationary increases in relation to the ATS EP services, inclusion services that exist within the budget, and that brings us back to that position of 5.449 million predicted overspend this year. Whilst it's unpalatable and it's not a pleasant story to have to present, frankly, I think it paints a true picture of where the system is and the level of need that is coming through the system, and ultimately we have a duty to make sure the provision is in place to support children. This is based on the trends and the experience we've seen over the last 3-4 years since the code of practice changed. This is what we would expect to see at the end of this year. And I think from my perspective, what I don't want to do moving forward this year, and as we go on to talk about program development and the things that we want to do, what I don't want is a budget that's continually moving away from me, like I had last year, where every meeting we were saying is off forecast, is moving because the trends are still continuing. This I hope will paint a picture where, as we come back to each school forum meeting, we'll get confidence that the forecasting and our understanding of the level of need in the system and what it's costing us will be far more accurate. So that's probably all for me, Andrew. I think you're on mute.
You're on mute, Andrew.
I'm not now. Okay. Can I ask if any members have any questions or comments they'd like to make about the high needs budget that Phil's just presented?
Nobody indicating at the moment. Just keeping a close eye.
Okay.
Oh,
all right.
David Alexander.
Sorry, Andrew.
That's quite right, David.
Phil, you've got in your paper that one of your assumptions is a proportion of children and young people with EHCPs educated in mainstream and special provision will be in line with 2019-20. Given, as you say, it's needs-led, I don't know how you're going to answer this, but how confident are you? Because that's a critical assumption, it seems to me, in terms of managing budget and in terms of definition of need, almost.
Pretty confident, I think. We've got trends on it over a 3-4 year period, looking at the proportions in mainstream, special school, and independent. What we saw last year was a position where actually specialist provision, and I'm sure the special school heads on the forum would concur, special school provision was effectively full. We commissioned under full capacity, but in the end, all of our special schools were full. So actually, we're expecting that trend to continue again this year. What we will see is a full special school system, a proportion that are still able to access mainstream education, and that number hasn't changed significantly over the period. We've been moving at around about 40% of total EHCPs being educated in mainstream. What we will then see is a continuation of what we saw last year, is that where we are at capacity in our special school provision, we will see that increase in independent. Ultimately, if significantly more children and young people are able to stay in mainstream, then we will see a reduced cost, because ultimately going out of the mainstream will end up ultimately in more expensive, often independent now specialist provision.
Right, thank you very much, Phil. Any more questions at all?
No one else.
Okay, thank you,
Steve Savory's just come up.
Hello, Steve.
Hello. I guess all of those predictions can't take into account the number of vulnerable children who are currently not in school, returning to school with significant additional difficulties. So it's unclear, isn't it, what kind of percentage of increase that's likely to bring. It's unlikely to be a decrease.
Can I just respond to that, just based on the previous comments? So I think we've ring-fenced, like I said, in COVID, we have ring-fenced $500,000 of the funding to try and support in that area. What I'm very conscious of is, and we've already had the conversations internally within the local authority, that we might expect to see a spike in level of need and support that's required in the system, and that therefore at the moment, as we've talked about a lot in the past, means application to effectively for an EHCP. And what I can't see is a compelling case for children being entered into a long-term statutory plan to support a short-term need that's been generated by the COVID. And what that working group that I mentioned needs to be able to look at is how can we provide funding and support to the system without needing to enter into statutory processes and like I said, permanent exclusion to support children and young people that we know are going to really struggle to access mainstream. If it requires additional funding to support, that's a much better use of funding than it is to start locking ourselves into long-term statutory plans if it's not required, and that's what worries me, I guess, in that COVID element.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Any more comments or questions?
Sorry, Andrew, I just had a bit of a technical hitch at my end, so I've had to swap devices.
Okay.
Can you drop the, Phil, can you just drop the presentation down?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. Let's see if I've still got the... I don't see anyone else indicating. Oh, actually, Joe, have you got the host? Because the host has dropped from me. You'll be able to see hands.
Yeah, I've got it. I'll just have a check.
Do you want to send it back to me? Apologies, everyone.
Stuart here. I'd like to ask a question, if it's okay.
Just hang on just a sec. Just pause a sec, because we just a slight technical hitch. Or Joe sends the.
Sorry, what do you want me to do?
You can assign the host to me.
Right. How do I do that?
So you will do the.
Sorry, Simon. I think you'll find Phil Haslip is now the host.
Right. Okay. Can we just? Sorry, everyone. Just a slight issue.
Brian.
I'm showing as Neil Eggles as the host.
Yeah.
Have you got it, Neil? I think what you can do.
Oh yeah. How do I get rid of that then?
Yeah. If you go to the icon with the person on.
Yeah.
You can probably see now with people putting their hands up. And then see the one in the middle with the you can see the arrow upwards. If you go on that one, I think you can assign the host to me.
I'm just going to message Ryan to see if he can jump in.
It just talks about optimizing for video sharing.
Go to the person. Go to the one with the participants.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then left or right click on me, and I think you'll probably be able to give me the host.
Done. Simon, sorry, Ryan's going to join back in so that he can change it back.
Yeah, because it's obviously just dotting around.
Yeah.
You see, Neil, if you click on me, on the participants, you should be able to give me host.
It's not. I can't see something that says. Oh, hang on. Change role to host. Have I done that right, or have I done it to the wrong? Hang on.
Ryan is now the host.
To me.
Ryan.
That worked, did it?
Should come back. It hasn't come back to me yet.
Then,
which is Andrew. We're nearly there.
It's not me now.
Simon, Ryan is now back on as the host.
Right.
Okay. I've added you, Simon, now.
You got me as host. That's fine. Apologies, Andrew. We're back. We're back running. Okay.
Okay. Wonderful. Does anybody want to?
There was somebody that wanted to speak, I believe.
Okay. Who was that then?
I've got Stuart up at the moment. Stuart, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick question about some.
Yeah, okay.
Phil, just looking at your numbers on page 9 of the sheet, document you circulated, the 1920 overspent for high needs was 5.8 million. We've got an increase in funding in 2021 of 6.5 million, but you're projecting a deficit of 5.4 million. That would suggest to me that the costs in 2021 have increased by just over £6 million. And if that is the case, is that an increasing trend of that level of magnitude that could see us in deep difficulty in a couple of years' time?
It's effectively the impact of the full year costs of the children and young people that entered the system last year. So this, in 1920, those additional EHCPs, we won't have seen the full impact. So it's not necessarily a rising level in numbers. It's just the fact that this year we will see, for that cohort from the 1920 group that are now accessing an EHCP, we will see the full year cost of those EHCPs. So there's an additional cost in the system for that. The actual trend, we've assumed the same numbers in terms of additional children coming into the high needs budget. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a bad year, if you like, in terms of cost, but it's not going to continue exponentially over the next 2 or 3 years.
I mean, every year we will see that additional year cost of children on an EHCP. The only thing that's going to start to bring that curve down is if we start to see a reducing level of need. This is going to be a fairly common. If things continue the way they are, this will be the common picture for future years as well. But it's about
if the funding doesn't increase year on year, you would anticipate seeing a growing deficit of some significance over the next few years.
I believe so, and it's what other local authorities who talked about it at previous meetings and compared to other LAs. There are others that have kind of further down the line in terms of that level of need than we are, and they're continuing to see that. At this stage, unless there's significant change around the way the code of practice works or the funding system works, we will continue to see that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you very much, Phil. Can we now move on? So still on page 19 of the papers, but to look at these key drivers that you've listed for EHCP and permanent exclusion. Phil?
Yep. So I just feel at every meeting we need to look at these because I think it's important. They are the key drivers behind the high needs spend. So I'll include them in all papers moving forward. EHCP growth for us has continued. It's at 2.3% of the school population, which is in line again with the national picture. We've been tracking that position nationally. It was 2.1% last year. It's 2.3% this year, and we've been following a kind of national trajectory on that, hence the national issue around high needs. January 2019, we had 3,658 plans. We're currently just over 4,032. It's a net increase of 374 in that period. That's in line with our planning around budget, because obviously January 2019 includes a couple of additional months there. As we've discussed, the impact of COVID-19 on high needs is unknown at this stage. But what we do know is that our most vulnerable children are going to need more support to access education following a return for them. Many of them, some of them have been accessing provision throughout, but it's been limited numbers. We're obviously starting since the wider reopening to see more children coming back in, but actually at the point where we've got a fuller return to education, we're going to see a real need to support that particular group, as I've mentioned already. Before I go into the PECs, I guess I'll reiterate the point I made around this idea that there might be a spike in EHCPs because of COVID-19. That is something I'm very keen, like I said, to avoid, and that we start to look at the funding that we've got available, both potentially in high needs, but also from the COVID balance, the COVID funding that's available, to try and make sure that we're not locking children and young people into long-term statutory plans to support, hopefully, what is a short-term impact from permanent exclusion. Over the last couple of months, it's been zero. That's my joke contribution for the day. Permanent exclusion has been low and dropping across the county across the last 3 years. The data shown on the screen there is just showing that general trend. That's a positive. It's been a positive picture in terms of supporting a reduction in the use of permanent exclusion. In the paper, I think I point out that it isn't the only measure we should be looking at. And as part of the high needs strategy and development work, very keen for us to start considering a broader measure of outcomes for children than just a reduction in permanent exclusion. It's really positive. We need to make sure that actually whatever the alternative is to permanent exclusion is having a positive impact on their outcomes. But overall, a positive reduction around PECs. That has meant last year and this year that APS has been under significantly less financial pressure around places. I think when I started this time, March last year, there was significant pressure on APS places. All of our APS schools were full. We are now at a position where there is a capacity in that system to be able to support and to start looking at some of the focus on the early intervention work that we want to do, rather than just supporting places for children that have been PECs. So there's a positive move there around APS. It has contributed a little towards the deficit positions I mentioned around APS earlier in the outturn, because this is the first year that they've not been significantly under number, but they've been under numbers, and in previous years they were significantly over, so we're staffed as such. So there's a sea change there, but that's a positive move for us, I think, because it creates that additional capacity in that part of the sector to start focusing more on prevention support, which I will come on to later. What was at that point for questions around those, if that's okay, Andrew?
Okay, Phil, before we do that, I don't think it's just me, but I don't think you've put your presentation back up. So I don't think we saw your two slides then. Okay. Sorry, Phil's got a bit.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm going to blame.
I don't think that. Okay, I don't think that matters, because your first slide was pretty much covered by paragraph 2.1 in the papers, and your second slide essentially is the chart that's on paragraph 2.2 in the papers. So therefore, if people were following the paper while you were talking, then that would have been pretty much in line with your slides. Is that okay, Phil?
Yeah, so that was the first slide's on the screen now, and then the second one.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay.
We've got Eliza Entwistle that wanted to raise a point, Andrew.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Eliza.
Hi, I just wanted to unpick some of the data on the slide a bit further, if that was at all possible. Phil, can you tell us what the number of permanent exclusion was in 2018-19 and 2017-18 at mid-March, the point at which permanent exclusion stopped due to lockdown this year?
I can share that information. I don't have it to hand at the moment, no, but I can share it certainly.
Okay, and although it's a pleasing trend, I just would like to point out that the number of permanent exclusions in primary was up on last year, and again stopped at partway through the year.
Yeah, agreed. One thing I would say, actually, just in relation to that data, is this was prior to, this was a February report that was produced. So the data is prior to COVID in terms of the reduction. But yeah, I can share more detail.
Can I just confirm that? So the heading on the chart is 1920 year to date, and also 1718 and 1819 year to date. So they are.
Apologies. Apologies. The year to date would it, for 1920 was to February.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay.
Stuart, you've still got your hand up. Is that from before?
Stuart.
Is he there?
Hello, Stuart.
He's still got his hand up. I think he didn't lower it. I think that's what that is. Okay. No other people asking to speak, Andrew.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So back to Phil again. Can we move on to the high needs recovery planning, please?
Yeah. So I've outlined details of this in the report, and none of this is, I hope, new information. It's what we have done is structure the recovery planning into a clearer program of change, and we've recruited a person. We've recruited in a program team to start supporting the implementation of this. There are kind of three key factors that are underpinning it. Our recovery. The first part is around continued investment in high needs. We've touched on it already around the funding. Actually, at the moment in the system, nationally, we're seeing that rising level of need. If funding doesn't continue to support that, there is no recovery planning that is possible, frankly. The rising level of need has to be supported by a continued level of funding. It's not yet clear what funding and high needs will look like next year, but I'll point in terms of recovery planning with the DfE and our submission into them, which we will have to do, we will make the point that actually that rising level needs to be supported by additional funding. That we need to continue to focus on earlier intervention. Obviously, that reduces the level of need in the system for us, but most importantly, reduces our use of the more expensive provision, particularly for the cohort that we've discussed again previously with social, emotional, mental health who are coming through the system, and that is where we are seeing a significant rise in need. And then the third part to recovery was around reducing spend and activity. So we've got continued investment, a reduction in the use of high level or high cost provision through early intervention, but also a cost saving exercise that we're going to have to go through to look at areas that we can effectively stop funding, cease funding to support as part of recovery. And that, I think, needs to go through formal consultation. We are developing some thinking around that at the moment. I'd be really keen to have several members of the forum, 3-4 members potentially, who would be keen to support in developing that consultation, so that it's a co-produced piece of work that we can bring back to the forum in September. It wasn't an ask in the paper, but I think if there is an opportunity, if people feel they could put themselves forward now or after the meeting, Andrew, I don't know how you'd like to tackle that, but that would be welcomed.
Okay, thank you. Before asking if there's anybody who would like to do that, can I first of all check whether there are any questions that anybody wants to ask about that slide?
Jackie has just put a hand up.
Yeah, Jackie?
Yes, thank you. Just a general comment about the consultation process when people do engage with that. To please remember that budgets are approved and agreed by boards of governors in schools together with the head teachers. And so the consultation needs to involve governors as well as head teachers, please.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jackie. Okay, thanks for that clarification. We'll ask the question now, but I appreciate that it might be that people want to think about this. Are there any members who'd be interested in helping with the development of the consultation?
They could raise their hand.
Yeah, if you raise your hand.
Yeah, that would be good. Stuart's hand is still up. I think that's from before.
Well, let's think of something else we can volunteer him for whilst his hand is still up.
Or is he volunteering? Yes.
Okay. Okay, well, no hands raised?
Is that something Joe can go round
so.
and ask for volunteers afterwards?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, but if anybody was itching to do it, I'd hate to deny them the opportunity of putting their name forward just now. Okay, thank you very much. Can we now move on to the High Needs Development Programme, Phil?
Yeah, so in relation to the second point on the previous slide around kind of that focus on early intervention support, I said we structured into that piece of work into a programme of work. The outline of that and the governance structure was included in the papers as an annex. There is alongside the kind of main programme, there's a couple of other pieces of work that are kind of critical in terms of supporting and around the reduction of spend, and that specifically was around increasing capacity in the system. So the new SEMH special school, there was a short update in the papers around the award of that. So we've got Multi Academy Trust, LENAT, who've been approved as a sponsor through the Regional Schools Commissioner's Office, and that project is moving forward. At the moment, we're not clear on any delays caused by COVID. It does feel like a lot of the building projects are able to progress, but we obviously will see further whether there are any delays from COVID around the build on that. We've engaged, as we said in the previous meetings, with the Association of Special School Head Teachers and commissioned to capacity, and there was again an outline of that capacity in the schools in the papers, but a total of 1,293 places for the year. In terms of capacity, we're also looking at the communication and interaction centres, which are attached to mainstream as provision. A couple of schools have had financial concerns associated to those, and there's quite a variance in the way that they're operating. So there's been a review which is reporting to the Education SLT shortly of the CNI centres, and part of that is about whether there ought to be a recommendation to look further at that model of resource bases attached to mainstream, or whether it's something that we want to leave as it is at the moment in terms of capacity. It is obviously an opportunity to increase capacity in specialist provision. And we're currently looking at, the specialist commissioning team are also looking at how we might get some short-term solutions in place to support that rising level of SEMH need. We've got the special school being planned, but actually are we in a position where we could move some smaller projects forward more quickly. We're assessing potential to do that. That sits alongside that kind of review of the communication and interaction centres, because actually one option could be resource bases if that was something that was considered an option by schools. That work is underway, and the aim within all of that is to look at our capacity across specialist provision to try and reduce that use of independent specialist provision, which has been rising over the last few years. Within the transformation programme itself, there are 6 projects as in total, but actually 4 that really impact on the work that we're doing around funding and high needs. The other 2 are more closely linked to the joint additional needs strategy, looking at integrated commissioning and preparation for Ofsted. The 4 projects that are kind of outlined in there: spend redesign for SEND and EHCP. This is something that we're launching. We've talked about this in previous meetings, about starting to look at how can we adjust our funding model to look at a different way of supporting children with SEND outside of the statutory process. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. The primary local inclusion clusters, the secondary work, which has been through a number of discussions, forums, debates, and actually hopefully we're in a position to move forward and pilot something at some stage, COVID related delays around that one potentially. And then working with the alternative provision schools, looking at how we can transform the work and the provision that they're able to currently offer. First one around spend redesign, core part of that, again, it's been touched on in working groups previously, is can we move towards a common banding system for funding? So there's clarity across the system about how SEND funding is working, and consistency. At the moment, we have a lot of variance in terms of whether a child within the HCP ends up in specialist provision, mainstream provision, they're supported in the CNI centre or through independent. A common banding system will help us to get some degree of clarity and consistency across the piece. At the moment, with the individual top-ups into the mainstream, funding on that has been left behind, frankly, without any inflationary increases for some years now, and that needs to be reviewed as part of a common banding approach. Keen to look at how we can align it to the graduated pathway, so that actually funding can be available outside of the education, healthcare and care plan, and look at the My Plan Plus part of that, with a view to supporting improved transition. There's a need to align with transport, because if we're changing statutory process, aligning around the graduated pathway, currently transport is associated to the statutory plan, so we need to look at how that will operate. There's a co-production element and an evaluation element as part of that project as well. We've created project briefs around this, and the next step now is to start looking at design around this. There is some work taking place with secondary schools around the banding, a potential banding system. It has already, in the past, we've already looked at the further education system and have rolled out banding to them. But we're still now starting to look at that mainstream provision, and we'll be working with schools across the system to try and create a model there that works. So that would be spend redesign. Overall, very conscious with this particular element that we need to understand the data, the numbers, and start to really be able to clearly forecast, if we are focusing on an earlier intervention support, what kind of numbers that looks like and how that funding is accessed, to make sure there's consistency across the system, but also that we're not, by doing this, not significantly increasing costs, which we cannot afford to do. But downstreaming funding, like I say, will help reduce costs at the top end of the system. The primary local inclusion clusters, again, some work has started around this, and each of the clusters had started their own projects. Those have, funnily enough, ceased during COVID because they were mostly focused around training and professional development, which obviously can't continue, hasn't been able to continue, and I believe had some other priorities during that period as well. So that element of the work has ceased. But what I'm very keen to do is with the primary clusters, and speaking to the chair of that group this week about getting a meeting set up just before the break into the summer to start to plan into September, October, and the new year to start to move some of that work forward. What we want to be able to do ultimately with those clusters is get a very clear voice from schools about what their local inclusion needs are, to enable us to shape our services better, to support locally identified strategy, locally identified need. I think also potentially with that, make it clearer to schools what services and support is available. But certainly make the development of solutions more school-led. That will require a kind of development in the way that we are some of our inclusion systems and processes work. And a good example of that would be that if we want to support children and young people at risk of permanent exclusion at the moment, the only funding really that's coming through the system to do that is to permanently exclude them and to support them into APS that way. And be very keen for us to look at a change in the way that we operate our systems and processes to enable access to alternate support from alternative provision funded without the need for that permanent exclusion. So there's system and process change within that. I think particularly we're very keen to understand and get feedback around the impact of the project work and how that's starting to starting to have an impact. And I guess when it restarts for the local inclusion clusters, to be able to monitor that, look at what's working and be able to share that kind of practice across the 7 clusters. And like I say, all of this was premised on a need to try and align funding with the local strategy around inclusion, make funding available in a different way. I think as the secondary, we've kind of worked through a number of different models on this previously, and I know that Jamie Ford, with one of the working group sessions, went through some potential options around service level agreements and how this might operate moving forward. I think that was, as we've discussed in previous meetings, greeted with some challenges. I think the core principles we were also in agreement about that we wanted to make funding available earlier, support outside that need for permanent exclusion, but drawing red lines around not being able to permanently exclude, or some of the funding elements to support a permanent exclusion weren't going to operate. And actually, moving forward now, having had the conversation with Cheltenham, and I know that one of the other local areas are also considering some of the options. What we're keen to do is really understand how the cluster would like to operate in this model. We have some very clear messages around what, as a local authority, we feel we need in terms of a change in the system, and certainly that focus on earlier intervention support, that need for greater collaboration and support across the system, are an important part of what we see us doing. But I think we're in a position potentially with the Cheltenham Group when we're in a more friendly landscape post-COVID to start having discussions around what that model might look like, using the bones of what we've discussed before, but to shape it as a pilot around what the Cheltenham heads would see. Again, the core messages around this sit alongside that with the presented with the primary, which is that we want to be able to understand what the local needs around inclusion are from schools, so that we can respond to that, not just on an individual school basis, but to a local area and shape the services to support. So similar messages around funding. The only other thing that I would bring into the papers around this is an organisation called Social Finance, who the third sector provider, who are working with a couple of other local authorities nationally, have been looking at permanent exclusion, secured some private equity funding as a charity to support a programme looking at what works to support children and young people at risk of permanent exclusion. And so they're a potential research partner to support that project as and when we get moving. And then the fourth project, which kind of outlined in there, was around AP transformation. We haven't touched much on this in the past, and been in conversation with the alternative provision heads around this for some months now, around how we look at transforming what we currently offer to support a different focus, to support earlier intervention support, but to also invest a little bit more into a high quality learning environment would be the best way I would describe that. We have 5 alternative provision sites at the moment, and certainly 3 of those are not good learning environments, and we want to be able to address that issue. So the second point on that screen around the quality of the sites and the environments. If we want really high quality AP, we need to be able to provide the sites to be able to do that. As part of this, we're looking at how we commission primary and secondary provision separately. Alternative provision to date has been commissioned as 208 places across the county, with no separation between primary and secondary, no assessment necessarily of the level of need in either of those sectors or in any of the local areas, other than the broad view that there's 108 places commissioned at Gloucester and the Forest, and 54 at each of the Cheltenham, Tewkesbury and Stroud and Cotswold sites. As part of that commissioning of separate primary and secondary, making sure there are appropriate sites for both primary and secondary in some of those areas. The Gloucester and Forest have a dedicated primary site, but neither the Cheltenham nor the Stroud sites do. Again, working with them, and the focus on intervention support is very much being led by schools. So Nick Stanton, who's the head at the Stroud and Cotswold School, is starting a piece of work around primary, working with the other 3 heads and bringing in colleagues from the primary sector to start looking at what a good model for early intervention support might look like, how the schools might see that operating, the mainstream schools, and how the APS can respond to that. And then the final point is that link to the local inclusion cluster work. Actually, alternative provision, we've touched on it again on previous meetings. The alternative provision service has to be a part of supporting that local inclusion agenda, part of those conversations. We've encouraged, I know Stroud as a secondary group have been starting to think about some of their local issues and to come back to us with a proposal. They've been doing that in partnership with the APS in that area. So a positive kind of link between the work that happens with the primary local inclusion, the secondary local inclusion, and the development of an APS service. It's a whistle-stop tour of where we are with it, that each of those projects now has a clear project brief. We've recruited project managers, they're outlined in the governance structure. Senior responsible officers are in place. I'm very keen that there is a very clear structure and plan around how this is developed, how it moves forward, and a very clear link to the resource that's required to be able to move some of these issues forward. Because I'm conscious that prior to me joining the local authority, many of these issues have been discussed, and progress, I think, has to be made. So putting a proper programme and project support behind that to enable it has been a starting point for that. That's probably all on that, Andrew. So I'll take questions, and apologies for the level of detail.
No, not at all, Phil. It's really, really helpful to understand where we are. So can I ask if anybody would like to ask any questions or make any comments on Phil's presentation for the last few minutes?
Nobody indicating during the presentation, Andrew.
Anybody wants to ask anything now?
Nobody.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. So can we move on then to agenda item 8, where there are two aspects to this really. First is the, as Joe sent out in the papers, it's a decision to make about the constitution of the schools forum. And then after we've done that, we'll consider the request from the parent carer forum for them to have representation on schools forum. So Joe, is there anything that you want to highlight in terms of the update to the constitution?
Thanks, Andrew. I'll just run through it quickly.
Okay.
Yeah. So as part of this annual review of the Constitution, I've made a series of amendments as an overall tidy up and update. The amendments are outlined as track changes at Appendix 1, and the changes are summarised in the covering report. I'll just run through them quickly. The academies and school members are now grouped separate membership structure, and the arrangements for reviewing the structure have been added at paragraph 2.4. Substitute arrangements have been more clearly defined at paragraph 2.6. The arrangements for the election and nomination of schools, academy members and non-school members have been included at paragraphs 3 and 4. The core paragraph has been updated to take account of the amended regulations that provide school forums can meet remotely due to the outbreak of COVID-19 until March next year. The voting procedure has been slightly updated at paragraph 6.3, and paragraph 7, meeting documentation paragraph, reference has been removed to paper copies being distributed. So that's the key changes that I've made to the Constitution, and that's in response to the new publication of the Schools Forum Operational Guide and Good Practice.
Can I ask if any members have any questions about any of those changes or wish to make any comment?
Jackie has raised her hand.
Thank you. Jackie. Jackie?
You might be muted. Are you muted, Jackie? Do you want to drop your presentation down, Joe, just so we can see if Jackie is there?
Hello.
Hi, Jackie.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Andrew. First of all, I do note that it is 4 p.m. and a lot of our colleagues have left the meeting. Can I firstly confirm that are we still quorate to make any decision on this? Because you did say this was a matter for discussion and voting.
Yes, my colleague Andrea Griffiths is actually monitoring how many members are present at the meeting at all times. And Andy, we are quorate, aren't we? Sorry, Andy, you're muted.
A thumbs up.
Yeah, we are, Joe, but we don't want anyone else to leave the meeting if it's all possible. Okay.
Okay.
Pretty quickly.
I'll go as quickly as I can in that case. Thank you. I myself should be in another meeting at this point in time, but I particularly wanted to raise a couple of points on this item. The changes to the Constitution and the subsequent letter for consideration are in conflict with each other. The Constitution states that the school members should be 2/3 of the voting majority. Therefore, if the second part of this programme were to go ahead and consideration would be given to the letter that has been submitted, I presume they would qualify as a non-school member, and hence there is no space for them at the moment unless we alter the proportions of voting members. Therefore, I think both items need to be taken in a different order in order to look at that particular point of the Constitution, if members are inclined to agree to the request. If they are inclined to agree to the request, we would need to increase the number of voting members from the schools group by an additional 2 in order to balance it out. And therefore, if proposal is given to adopting this request, I would like to put in a counter request that the schools groups be increased in proportion to the percentage of pupils in each group. For example, that the secondary school governors and the primary school governors be increased to 4 each rather than the 3 + 1, so that they become 4 + 1 to balance that out. And I'd welcome people's views on that, please.
Thank you, Joe.
Can I just clarify that a second?
Yes.
So, regarding non-school members.
Non-school members, we currently have 2 diocesan reps, 1 post-16, PVI early years 2, trade union 1, and community representative 1, which makes a total of 7.
And we can have up to 9 non-school members. So 1/3 of 28 is 9. Is that right? That's the calculation I made.
So there is space for 1 more, is there?
Yes, there is.
Okay. In that case, I'll withdraw those comments then about an amendment. Thank you. The other question I did have was whether or not the balance of votes was correct. Am I right in presuming there are an equal number of students in the primary and the secondary sectors, so that it warrants the same number of representatives from each sector, please?
I don't know who's best to answer that. Phil, do you have the numbers immediately at hand?
not immediately at hand. I think the pupil numbers. I mean, I'd have to check this, and we'd have to look into this in more detail about that. The representation at the moment is premised really around the phase and making sure we've got a balance between maintained and academy representation rather than anything premised on pupil numbers, unless Joe tells me otherwise.
Okay. Can we leave that until ask the local authority to confirm that between now and the next meeting? I think it may well be the case that, well, we know there is an imbalance in numbers between the sectors, but I think from the numbers that I have in mind, if you switch the representation, you end up with a different imbalance between representation and numbers, but not a better balance, if that makes sense. It's a good job I'm not teaching maths anymore, isn't it? Okay, thank you. Is that okay, Jackie? Then we leave that till next meeting just to confirm that.
Yes, thank you. That's okay, with the potential that we may wish to raise or to review the membership and the balance of membership for the future.
Absolutely fine. That's great. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions or comments about the amendments that Joe has detailed? No?
I can't see any, Andrew. No one else raising any issues. So do you want to move to the vote on the first proposal?
I do. That's right. So therefore,
the first one is to consider and approve the proposed changes to the Constitution as in Appendix 1. Yep. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to go through the same process again, read names out. 1 or 2 people I think are missing, but Joe and Andy, we're still quora, aren't we? Just being absolutely sure.
We are. We've now got 30 members, so can the members please remain that we've got?
We'll get through this then. So right, we'll do the Constitution, the first part No. So if you could clearly say for, against, or abstain, as we did before. So David Alexander.
For.
Thank you. Matthew Bishop.
For.
Thank you. Sarah Byrne.
For.
Thank you. Eliza Entwistle.
For.
Thank you. Andrew Harris.
For.
Kirsten Harrison. Kirsten, you there?
For.
Thank you. Kate Hawkins.
For.
Thank you. Amanda Horniman.
For.
Thank you. I think Lisa Jones has left us.
Left.
Yeah, okay. Gwyneth Keane.
For.
Thank you. Becky Martin.
For.
Thank you. David Metcalf.
For.
Thank you. Will Morgan has left us.
Yes.
Sarah Murphy, I think, has left us. Alexander Norman.
Left.
Left. Okay. Jackie Phillips.
For.
Thank you. Steve Saviour, I think, has left the meeting.
Yeah.
Claire Steele.
He's left.
Yeah.
Adam White, so left.
Adam White has left the meeting. Rob Wilcock.
For.
Thank you. Stuart Wilson. Thank you. Okay, so that is carried.
Okay, thank you.
All votes in favour. And then, did you want to, Andrew, introduce there's the request then, isn't there, for an additional member?
Yeah, that's right. So if we can move on to the request for a seat on the Schools Forum from a representative of the Gloucestershire Parent Carer Forum. A copy of the letter has been sent out by Joe. I think probably the first thing I would ask is as to whether anybody wants to make any comment about that request.
Just looking through now. Not seeing anyone.
Can I mention something which has occurred to me? Because we need to be careful, I think, that Schools Forum can have open discussion. And obviously on Schools Forum, there are people representing a number of schools. And we would hate to get into a position where there was potentially any kind of conflict between the interests of a parent and someone on Schools Forum who's perhaps a head teacher or a member of the governing body of the school which that parent's child attends. This may seem unlikely, but it is possible. So, for example, if the person elected by the Parent Carer Forum was someone who perhaps had conflict with a member of the Schools Forum in terms of their work in their own school, then I think that would be unhelpful to the freedom of discussion in Schools Forum. So I wonder whether my own view is that we would ask the Parent Carer Forum to ensure that anybody who they suggest to join Schools Forum does not have a conflict of interest with any existing member of the Schools Forum. In other words, to avoid nominating someone whose child attends one of the schools represented on Schools Forum. I hope that makes sense. I don't know if anybody wants to come back at me about that.
Amanda Horniman.
Amanda. You're muted, Amanda.
Andrew, but do we
now, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
It's a good point, but do we do that now? My children might come to somebody's school who's on the School Forum now, and therefore there would be a conflict of interest as well.
That's an interesting point. I suppose that where I'm coming from is that I think there is potentially and I need to be careful here. It's a slightly different relationship when you have a head teacher of a school, primary or secondary, or a governor of a school. I think that's slightly different from the organisation that's asking for a seat now. I can't really expand on that, but I feel we need to be careful here.
I agree. I'm just thinking of equality of everybody having.
I get that. Certainly, you wouldn't want to complicate the constitution for all members in an unreasonable way or possibly an illegal way. But I think that there needs to be, at the very least, a request that any conflict of interest is avoided.
You've got Jackie Phillips as well.
Jackie.
Andrew, thank you. I think it's a very, very valid point that you were trying to raise very tactfully there. I would note that I don't believe there is anything in the Constitution that allows us to dictate how another organisation might elect their representative. And therefore, we either have to accept that they will elect whomsoever they please or wish to do so, or and that person be their valid representative at the forum, or not accept them as a place, but give them a voice to comment, maybe as a non-voting observer or participant. And I don't know whether or not the Constitution can be amended to allow for that voiced opinion without subsequent vote.
Okay. Certainly, yes. We leave it to head teacher organisations certainly to nominate someone who they feel suitable. And as you say, there are no demands placed on those or no specification placed to limit their choice, I suppose. And perhaps I'm worrying unnecessarily. Is there something that needs some further consideration between now and the next meeting, perhaps? Any Jackie forward?
Yes, I think this is the principles. I'm not objecting to the organisation or receipt of the letter from any organisation. I do want to make that clear. But the principles of who are the voting members, the number of voting members, the proportions, I think are worthy of a more detailed discussion with more of the representatives of the schools forum present. So I would prefer to see this item higher up on the next agenda to allow time for a proper discussion on this, Andrew.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I would want to emphasise that I think that representation from Parent Care Forum on Schools Forum is entirely appropriate, and they would be most welcome to join the discussion, and particularly with our mutual interests in special education needs and high needs. So it'd be really good to have somebody from the Parent Carer Forum, but I just think we need to be a little bit careful about how we manage that. So if that could come up for an item for discussion at the next meeting, and then I'm sure we can find a way through for this.
Okay.
Okay, Andrew. Yeah, so that's deferred for perhaps the first proper item on the next agenda. Is that all right, Joe?
Fine. Yep. Work around that.
And then everyone's present. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Charlotte is trying to say something, but is muted.
It's just Charlotte.
Me now?
Yeah,
can you hear me now? Yeah. I just wanted to reassure forum members that the Parent Carer Forum are the local authorities' strategic partner for co-production and Parents' Voice. They have a contract with national organisation, which means they have to take that strategic view, and their membership is purely based on them representing all parent carers rather than their own individual view. They're prohibited from doing that. So I just wanted to provide that assurance.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. I think in terms of school weeks, it's not long from this meeting to the next one. We're nearly at the end of one academic year, September meeting. So in terms of school week, not long. So if we can just consider it then in detail, and then hopefully we'll find a way in which we can welcome a member from the Parent Carer Forum.
Andrew, Amanda's still got a hand up. I don't know, is it just you haven't lowered it, or did you want to say something?
You're muted, Amanda.
She lowered it.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
No one else indicating to speak, Andrew.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. I think that business of the meeting. So therefore, may I close the meeting at, I think it's about 4:16 p.m. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I hope that you found the meeting useful, even in this remote way of working. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We'll close the YouTube broadcast down now.
Okay.
So if you can all log out, that will be excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.